All right, welcome back, guys. This is Brian from the SE Optimist, and this is part 2 of my initial walkthrough of using the Divi Builder. In part 1, we covered setting up a Divi and going through the customizer and things like that, and in this part 2, we're going to get hands-on with actually constructing pages and how to use the builder itself. Of course, this video, it assumes that you've initially set it up yourself, or perhaps you've had a site designed by somebody already using Divi and you just want to know how to use the builder to make changes yourself. In any case, we go to Pages, and you can either edit existing pages or you can say Add New. I'm going to say Add New. We'll click out of this. You see by default, it takes us to the regular WordPress edit page. What you probably want to do first is set your title in. I'm going to call it Demo. You can set your things over here like you normally would. And if you have an SEO plugin installed, you could, in advance, set up what your meta title and description are going to be just so that they're good. And then you want to click Save Draft. Then from there, you would say Use Divi Builder. Now, something I want to comment about, you'll see that it's loading for me. It loads right into the front end of the site, which is generally 99% of the time where I will use Divi. I like to be able to see what I'm doing. If you have a plugin installed that gets rid of the block editor for posts and things, that you don't like that change that WordPress made and it restores the classic editor, you'll notice that even after you click the Edit with Divi option, it'll still be on the back end of the site and you could use visual stuff there. But there's an option back there to say Build on the front end. Click that option and then that'll take you to what you're looking at now. Everything I'm going to show you in this video is building on the front end, so at least bear with me through this. If you end up later preferring, for whatever reason, to build on the back end, you can, but even doing that will make a heck of a lot more sense after you've watched what I'm going to show you on the front end. So, when we get to this part, it's going to give you 3 options of how we can start working with this page. I'm going to start from the right. Clone an existing page. This is useful after we've gotten a couple of pages done, and we like the way they look, especially for service pages, if you're going to have quite a few of them. Say you spent some time already designing the perfect page for one of your services, and the rest of your service pages, you pretty much want the same idea as far as how it's going to look. You can clone a page, and then it's going to ask you which one. You pick that one, and then it's going to load everything you did on that page to start with. And then that makes it easy to just edit things like the title and some of the text and some of the pictures, but saves you a ton of time not having to arduously put that whole design together again. So that's really useful once we've built a page. Divi also comes with, I think, well over 50 or 70 pre-made templates by the professionals who made Divi. Some of them are really slick looking. You can pick from pre-made layouts from in here, and then it'll just load everything for you, and you can change, of course, from there things like the text, the graphics, etc. I would definitely recommend, if you pick this option, that you do plan to make some tweaks yourself, just because obviously everybody else who bought Divi, like you, has this option, and you don't want your site to end up looking too similar to somebody else who just picked this option as well. For the purposes of our tutorial, I'm going to say build from scratch, which basically tells it we're not going to start with anything, and we're just going to use the builder to do it all. So you can see that this looks like what we were looking at in the last video. This is my header and my navigation, and here's my footer area. The builder is what controls everything between the two. So I don't want to start with this. I'm just going to click this to make it happy so that it stops popping up, and I want to illustrate this in order. So you can think of the Divi Builder kind of as a table, and everything is broken into 3 color-coded pieces. You can see that this is blue, this is the green for row, and then this is gray for modules. Modules are the actual objects that you see, whether it's text blocks, pictures, blurbs, blogs, whatever you want to put. All of those things are modules. But how we control how those modules are situated is they have to be housed within a row. And that row in this case can be one column, it can be any variety that we'll get into in a second of different shapes and sizes for the columns, and that's stuff that we control in this green row. The rows are contained within sections. You notice that the section goes all the way across the screen. You might end up having quite a few rows in a section, Basically, where you would use a section versus a row, if you're wondering what the difference is say that I want to start with a header here that introduces the title of the page. So I'll go in this order, and then this part will make sense in a minute. So I'm going to click the plus to add a new module, and this pops out a little thing where we have options of the different types of modules that we can pick from. Note that there is a post title module. I don't generally use that because what that's going to do is it automatically just pulls in the text from whatever we called the page on the back end. Generally, what I call it on the back end and how I want to phrase it on the front end are not the same. And so you can accomplish the same thing by just using a general text widget. It's going to pop up this box. It has a bunch of filler content in here. Let me type demo page, and you can see as I type it in here, it starts appearing over there. Now, because this is the page title, I want to select it and click here where it says paragraph and say that it's a heading 1. Now that knows that it's a page heading. There are things we can do to style this, but first I want to explain what I started talking about a minute ago. So click the check to save that change. So now we have, as you can see, the gray outline. This is our text widget that makes that happen, and it's contained within this row. Now, say we want a background of some kind for this whole header area. We can do that if we want it to take up the whole width here in the section. So let's click this gear for the settings of the section. Under background, here's where we get those colors again. Let me pick, just for fun, a yellow. Now you can see that it applied yellow to this whole section. If we would rather do an image instead of a color, it starts here. We go over 2 of them to this, say add image, and it's going to take you to either where you can upload one or go in your media gallery. Just for fun, let me pick this image of this guy running and say upload image. Now you can see that it put it there. Now, of course, our current section isn't tall enough to show that whole image. There's a couple of different things you can do here. By default, it's on cover. You can say fit, which is going to constrain it to whatever fits vertically in our space. Obviously, that doesn't look very good. Or you can say actual size. It's not actually wide enough to take up our whole screen space, but the advantage is it's not stretched, but the disadvantage is we have this weird looking yellow on the sides, which is why, generally speaking, you'll probably want to say cover, which allows it to stretch to fit whatever space you're going to do. Now, if we wanted to see more of this guy, actually, let's go back in here. That's under design. Now, this is going to be where we're in a lot for these different objects. Layout we can leave alone for now. Basically, we want to go into spacing here, where we see margins and padding. Now, a commonly asked question in web design is what's the difference between margin and padding, because they accomplish kind of similar things. You can think of it like margins is the amount of space that exists from the edge of where an object is outward, away from it. So watch this. If we say 50 pixels top margin, see how it made space between this section that we have and the header area. Maybe that looks good for what you're trying to do. In this case, that obviously doesn't look so good, so we'll get rid of it. But what if I wanted more space from this edge down to the elements that we have in here? Well, if we put that same 50 pixels in padding, now you see that it made more space on the inside. And if we match that to the bottom there, now we've made more space that we're starting to see more of this guy. Now, a big thing that you're going to want to do when you're playing with paddings and margins, period, on any elements on this page is to pop out right here. When you put your mouse there, you'll see this option of the little, looks like a little phone. If you click it, you'll notice that now it creates tabs for desktop, tablet, and phone. This is where you can tell it different settings depending on which device you're looking at. By default, when we click tablet, you'll see that it carried over the 50 that we had from desktop. But because the screen gets noticeably less wide, it actually can create a more squished in vertical space so we see more of this guy. So we might be in a position where we say, well, we actually only want 40 pixels of padding on a tablet to account for that. And then if we notice we go to phone, see how much more squished in that is? Now in our case, maybe we want to see more of this guy, but say we didn't. Now we want to say only use 25 when someone's on a phone. and we can do that. And then it will know to use these different settings depending on which device someone is looking at it. And since it gives us a preview of what the site looks like, it makes it very easy in each of these views to know what we're dealing with. Okay, click check to save that. Now, here's how, going into there, we could style this text up a little bit. Let's go into the gear for settings here, and we'll go into design. Text means regular body text, which in this particular text block we have none because it's only a heading. So we're going to go to heading text. By default, H1 is selected. That's what we used here, so anything we apply here goes to that. If we had H2s and 3s, we could click these tabs and start changing settings for those. So default means whatever we had specified in the customizer that heading fonts were going to be is what it's going to use. Generally, you'd probably do that. But if for some reason we wanted this page to have a totally different heading font than all the other pages, you can manually pick something from here. And font weight is how thick or thin the font's going to be. If I pick light, see how that goes into a very slender font. If I want it to be bold, we can do that to make it thicker. And you can apply italicize. You can make it all capitalized or drop caps. With that option, if you want it underlined or strike through, you can do all of those things as well. Alignment, we do want to change. Let's center it so that it's in the middle. And then we can control colors and sizing if we want that different than what we defined as the default in the customizer right there. Sometimes to help set it off from a background, we can use a shadow. It's subtle there. And if you want to control the settings of a shadow, I find it's usually set to, this is the RGB thing. Basically, that's red, green, blue. And then this last thing is how see-through or not it is. If it's 1, it's entirely present, 100%, can't see through it. The closer to 0 it gets, the more translucent it becomes. By default, the shadow is 0.4. If you want it to be a heavier shadow, you can go up to, say, 0.7. It's probably hard to tell on this dark background, but that made the shadow a little bit darker and more intense, and that can be helpful to set the text off. Also, you can do some of the same settings we were talking about a minute ago with sizing and spacing. You get into the margins and padding. This text widget can have its own padding and margin to set it away from other widgets and objects that are in this row if you want. That's just down to design, which is going to be best to add padding to which element and where. Okay, so let's say that for now that's where we want to be for the header. This is now to explain why you would want to use different sections. Say we now want an intro paragraph that talks about our business, and we don't want it to look like this. See this little blue plus? That means to add a new section beneath the section we're currently in. So if I click it, it's going to ask me, do I want to insert a regular one or a specialty? We'll get into specialties later, but probably 99% of the time you're going to pick regular. So let's do that, and then it's going to ask you what kind of row you want to use. We can, just for illustrative purposes, you can see that down here you have all different options of what the different column setups are going to look like. Let's pick just these two for now. So you can see that it's made a 2-column row where we can put things side by side. So you can do things here like pick an image. Let's just pick the picture of me. So I could have a picture of me here, click that, and then I could put text and then start editing that there. One thing I want to point out too when you're editing text is you see that you can actually click right in the content and start making changes and type in here. The reason I don't generally do that, even though it is nice, is there's a weird bug I've noticed, at least in the browsers that I use, with Divi, where when I'm at the end here, say I want to start a new paragraph, when I hit enter, see how nothing actually happened? And what it's adding into here, if we go into the code mode, it added the code for a non-breaking space. So it added this space kind of a new paragraph without actually taking our cursor down there. And this can actually, when we have more text below it, see how that creates an unnatural amount of space? Because there's an invisible element here that non-breaking space code put that's not what we want. And it gets squirrely like that. So I'm going to delete that out of here. We'll go back into visual. This is the what you see is what you get editor. That's kind of like Microsoft Word, where you can do bold, italics, bullet lists. You can control the alignment here as well, that kind of thing. So when I want to start a new paragraph, you notice that if I do it in here, it works properly. It goes down, and then I can start typing, and we have the correct amount of space. I'm not sure why that problem persists or how many other people that might affect, but just take it from me. It's probably easier to just move your little box here to the side so you can see what you're changing there as you're typing it in here, but type it in here so that it's easier to follow. And if we want to change things about that text in here, we can. Again, whatever defaults we set for body text in the customizer, it's going to automatically use, but stylistically, if we want this particular text object to, say, have a different font or bold, or say we want it to be bigger, let's go with 24 pixels instead of 18. Now we can make this box bigger and punchier, and we can apply those things there. And as we mentioned in our video with the customizer and the default Divi options, there was the row where we could declare default swatch colors for brand colors and things that we're going to be using all the time. Had we started substituting some of these for our own colors, it makes it real easy every time we're in any of these settings to change colors about anything. Those colors are going to be right here so that we don't have to click this and arduously find it in the swatch tool or punch in the hex code each time to do it. And it's just selectable as one of these. This is, like we mentioned in the last video also, where you can control things like text line height and etc. If you want it to be different than what you declared as a default. And if you want all of the text in this block and not just one piece to have a certain alignment, we can center it or do stuff there. We can right align it if we want. And if you don't want to have to get into specific colors, this text color is set to dark. If we change it to light, and we hadn't picked a color from up there, it would make it light. Right now it's not doing it because we had declared a color. But that's an easy way to toggle it from basically black to white, depending on what background you're using for that. And speaking of background, let's go back over to content. You notice that, and this is going to be true for every element, whether it's a module or a row or a section. Underneath the main things, background is the choice second to the bottom on each of them. We can set a background for just this text widget, and it's not going to be the whole column that this is in, except the text ends up being really close to the edge. So if we ever do set backgrounds for like the text widget itself, we probably then want to go into design and then spacing again, where we can talk about the padding to create some space here so it's not so cramped. So let's say 20 on the top and 20 on the bottom. See how that created a little room so that it's not so stuffed in, and you can put a fairly similar one for the sides, and that looks a little better. And you can layer these as well if you want. So say in addition to this yellow background, we also wanted a background for this whole column. We can control that in the row settings. Let's see where it has the two columns here. We'll go to the gear on the second one and see how we have the background option there. So now anything we pick there, it's going to apply to that whole column. Also, if we've already made a row and we decide we want the proportions of sizes to be a little different, you can change the setup of the columns of a row at any time by clicking this little thing. When you click it, it'll pop out the layout options again. So if we pick this one, say, that's going to make this column less wide and this one more wide, proportionate to each other. So it makes my picture a little smaller and it makes that text a little bigger. That can give you some design choices that you want to do there too. Or maybe you even want the option for a third column that we didn't have before. So we can pick this one if you want them all to be equal. Or in this case, the center one much fatter than the sides, and we'll get into where you would use that in just a second. So you can change that any way you want there. And you can clone things at will at any time. So say that we've set up this row just the way we want it, and we know that in a minute we're going to want another row that's constructed fairly similarly, and we don't want to have to go through all the trouble of setting everything again. You can click this little button here that says duplicate, and if I click it, you see now that underneath it there's another one just like it. So now all we have to do is click on, say, this image and change it to a different picture and make this text different, but now we've got two things that are similar. And an expansion of that you can do is Say that I've constructed something like a fancy picture or a contact form. I'll even go into this and pick that out of here just so you can see it. Contact form. And it has some of the background that we were playing with a minute ago for that column and different options, which we can get into another time for how to do this. But say we did a whole bunch of different settings for how the contact form works. And we know that we're going to be using this contact form repeatedly elsewhere in the site, and we don't want to have to go through all this trouble of getting it dialed in just right every single time. So let's click out of that. When we highlight over it, see how this little option right there with the downward arrow that says Save Module to Library, if we click it, it'll ask you what you want to call it. We can call it contact form or whatever you want, and then click Save to Library. Now, in the future, anytime we have this little plus to add a new widget, see how it says we've only so far been using this new module and picking from here. See this says Add from Library up here? If we click this, anything we've saved in the past is selectable. I have a CTA button. Let's just, for grins, use that. See how it made that button? So you can call it up on any page of the site in the future. And one other thing that you want to know as a differentiator there is sometimes you want to call up that version of it that you saved, but then you want to be able to make changes to it that are unique from the last time you used it. And doing it the way we just did it is perfect for that. But what if, say, you say, I want to make a contact form that is consistent on every single page of the site. I don't want it to ever be different. I want the settings to be the same way. And I want it to be that if I make changes to it one place, it automatically applies those changes to every other place on the site where I've ever used that form. You can actually do that. So we start the same way with telling it we want to save it to the library. But then after we pick the name, we scroll down a little. See this checkbox for make this a global item? You would check that. Now it's going to outline in green. Let's do test, save to library. Now you notice when I highlight it, it's not gray anymore. It's sort of a lime green. That's a visual cue to you that it's a universal or a global item. Any change I make to this will update in the library, and it will change that to everywhere else on the site I've used that form. That's really handy if in the layout for your service pages and stuff like that, you've come up with a form, and now you know that when you tweak something on this visually or in its settings, all of your service pages are updated at the same time without having to arduously go through a whole bunch of places. It's useful, but where you wouldn't always use that is if I wanted, say, one contact form to work a little different than the others, global would be bad because if I make a change on this page, it will change it on the last page I was just on as well, and maybe I don't want that. Okay, so you can also do some other visual things with rows and sections like adding borders. If I click border here, this is all the way around. That's a border on the top, on the sides. Say I want a border on the top here. How wide do I want the border in terms of pixels? I can say 1, 2, and go on up. That's 3. We can pick what color the border is going to be. Let's pick blue. And then you can pick the style of it. This one's solid. You could make it dashed if you want. You could make it ridged, dotted, etc. You get the idea. Hit check. So that's kind of a divider between things. And what I like to do too on a lot of my designs just to make things stand out is, say I have like these areas that are all white background just in different stuff. To really make it stand out now, I'm going to want a new section. Let's start with just basic row. And I want this section to have a starkly different background color. So maybe I pick blue, and then I click in here and I drag it to a darker blue like that. Now that's very distinct from everything else. And now when we make, say, a text widget in here, I'm going to tell it that I want the text to be light. See how that makes it white? And I want the text to be 20 pixels large. Now that looks nice as a visual distinction from everything else, especially if I have a section after it that's white again. It really breaks up the content to the eye to do it that way. And you can see how easy that is to do. And that again is why we would use sections to basically control major background changes and things like that. Now, if I want a couple of different things to be happening in this blue area, that's why I would keep them all inside of the one section and either add another widget within this row, or if I want a special layout, I could just say that I want to create a new row. So let's duplicate it just to get us some space here. And then I'll go to this one and say, maybe we want that kind of setup. So now we've got a fairly wide one and a slenderer one. If you have this set just the way you want it to, you can always click duplicate on any item that you do, make 2 of them, and use this little thing to drag it. And now I have quick text that I can just edit in here in 2 different parts. And all of this is part of this one section with the nice blue background. You can put images or whatever else you want in there for the same way. When you have images, some cool things that you can do to set them off a little and make the site look fancier. Go under design here. Now under alignment, this is how aligned within that column it's going to be. If we center it, it's probably taking up all of the space that it has, so we don't really in this case notice a big difference when we change the alignment. Spacing, we have the same options for padding and margins and stuff. By default, Divi always puts a little bit of blank white space underneath an image. If we don't want that, we can take that off if we want other items to be directly under it or control that padding ourselves. If you want an image to have a border, you can do that. Or you'll notice where it says rounded corners. If you don't like that the image is square and you don't want to have to go into Photoshop and round it yourself, you can actually do it in the builder here. The higher the number that we put, let's say 20, see how it rounds that? If I go up to 50 from there, see how that rounds it a lot more? So you can control how round you want it to be. Now this little link in the middle here means it's going to keep all of the corners consistent. If you don't want it the same, you can click this to unlink it and then say we make this corner 80. You notice how now it's asymmetrical, and you could make that the same on that corner to give it kind of a swish look. You do some stylistic stuff like that. Box shadow is where we could apply a shadow to the entire image here. So see if I pick this, there's a very faint outline. To make it more visible, do a couple things. Blur strength is how long the shadow is. The longer it is, the lighter it becomes. So it defaults to 18. I often set it to 12 to make it a little bit tighter. And then on the color here, like we mentioned earlier, where this last number in the sequence is a decimal and it controls how see-through it is. It starts at 3. You can jump up to 6 or even 7. And you notice that that becomes a bit more noticeable. This first choice that I've picked with the shadow is very faint. If I click, say, this one to show a shadow on the bottom, you see that that is a bit more noticeable than the other one was. You can even, on this slider, without affecting that number, just click and drag this all the way up. So now we have a heavy black shadow applied to the bottom. And you can play with different designs. If you want one that's on the side as well, if you want an inward-facing shadow, one that comes up on the top there, etc. If you've changed your mind and you don't actually want a shadow anymore, you can click that back off. Okay, one last little thing I want to show as far as an introductory crash course to this goes, is you see down at the bottom here, there's this purple thing with the 3 lines. If I click it, it pops out a whole bunch of options. So this is kind of like we saw in the settings earlier. By default, it's on desktop. If I click this, it's going to shrink the site down into what it might look like on a tablet, just so I can see what we got here. And same deal for phone. And then I can click it to go back. If you want to save the entire page setup to the library, you can do that here. And then this is where you would either save this page as a draft to work on later, but not outwardly show it to viewers of the site. Or if we say publish, it's going to save everything we've done and make this page live and visible to somebody. And then if we don't want this here anymore, we can click that X and it pops back in. There's plenty more that you can do with Divi to get fancier, but we'll cover that in other videos. I don't want to overwhelm people if they're new to Divi with throwing way too much at them, but I think that's a pretty good, like, at a glance overview of how you can change different things and make things a certain way in here. And if you know this, you can experiment with some things and figure it out yourself. And maybe we'll make some more videos in the future to cover more advanced Divi editing. But I hope this was helpful for you guys to get a basic understanding of using the Divi Builder, and I'll catch you in the next video.